Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating and, kind of grim historical paradox. We're going to look at how a devastating human tragedy actually caused a massive wealth transfer that ultimately ended medieval serfdom in Western Europe. It's a story of supply, demand, and how sudden shocks, much like the economic disruptions we see in our own modern labor markets, can completely rewrite the rules of society.
But, to truly understand this massive economic shift, we first got to grasp the sheer, terrifying suddenness of the Black Death as it struck in the late 1340s. Retired Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzenos described the scene in Constantinople, noting that no physician's art was sufficient. The psychological toll was just as heavy as the physical one. People fell into deep despair, which honestly only aggravated their condition. The disease was swift, violent, and utterly indiscriminate.
So, this brings us to the core question of our explainer today. When the dust finally settled, how did such immense devastation actually empower the poorest surviving classes? How does a catastrophe that wipes out millions end up drastically improving the living standards of the survivors at the very bottom of the social ladder?
Section 1. The Grim Catalyst. The rapid spread of a global epidemic. Let's quickly trace the origins of this disease to really understand the economic shockwave that followed.
You see, the path of the plague was driven relentlessly by military conquest and the very global trade networks that were unifying Eurasia at the time. The swift conquests of the Mongol troops allowed localized diseases to travel across entire continents. During the siege of Kaffa in 1347, infected corpses were literally lobbed into the city, and from there, Genoese trading vessels caught the virus and unwittingly spread it to ports all across Mediterranean Europe.
The sheer scale of this tragedy is just staggering. Between 1348 and 1351, experts estimate that out of a total European population of 80 million, 25 million people died. That is nearly a third of the continent's entire population wiped out in just a few short years. And the Islamic world suffered comparably, with whole nations devastated and populations just vanishing.
And in some specific regions, the localized devastation was even worse. Places like England and Wales are estimated to have lost almost half of their entire populations to the plague. Italy, too, lost about a third. The sheer volume of human loss is almost difficult to wrap your head around.
Which brings us to Section 2, a drastic labor shortage, the economic aftermath. Let's examine the immediate economic reality left in the wake of such massive loss of life.
Okay, so the absolutely crucial point here is that while the human toll was catastrophic, the physical capital was totally untouched. Think about it. The plague did absolutely nothing to the land, the farms, the buildings, or the infrastructure. Suddenly, you have this massive imbalance, a vast amount of productive land and tools, but a drastically reduced number of humans to work them. Human labor went from being abundant and cheap to incredibly scarce and valuable, pretty much overnight.
So, with less human labor around, who would actually work the lands? This exact question absolutely terrified the landowning nobility. The foundation of their wealth was their land, right? But land is completely worthless without people to plow, plant, and harvest it. This severe labor shortage set the stage for a dramatic shift in leverage, transferring power directly away from the lords and straight into the hands of the surviving commoners.
Section 3. Demanding better living standards. The peasants' leverage. This is where we really start to see the peasants using their newfound leverage in action. Workers suddenly realize, wait a minute, my labor is incredibly scarce, and that meant they could demand luxuries they literally never had access to before. They turned their noses up at employment unless the terms were wildly in their favor. Contemporary accounts tell us laborers demanded triple their previous wages just to be enticed to work. English workers even started demanding meat pies and ale as part of their standard compensation package. It was essentially a medieval Great Resignation. Landlords were thrown into desperate competition, literally poaching laborers from neighboring estates just to keep their own farms from collapsing.
This sudden spike in living standards was undeniable, and it wasn't just happening in Europe. Check out the dietary shift for an average citizen in Cairo. Post-plague, their daily caloric intake almost doubled. They were eating significantly more protein and fat. The scarcity of labor meant they were finally wealthy enough to afford a vastly improved diet, which included greatly increased meat consumption. Now, obviously, this newfound lower-class wealth had macroeconomic consequences. It resulted in rampant inflation for goods, higher labor, and foodstuffs. I mean, everything basically became twice as expensive. However, because so many people had died, there was a massive surplus of empty housing.
So this meant that while lords had to pay much higher wages, the rental income they could actually collect from their tenants dropped by up to 30% in places like England.
So, as a direct result of paying higher wages and collecting much lower rents, noble families across Europe found themselves seriously struggling financially. Their traditional economic model was just breaking down. You can clearly see this decline reflected in the dwindling number of belted knights in Europe, which dropped from about 3,000 in the year 1300 down to just 1,300 by the year 1500. The aristocracy was bleeding wealth.
All right, moving on to Section 4. Why wage legislation failed, the elite backlash. Let's analyze exactly why this top-down attempt to control the labor market spectacularly failed.
So, the elites push back. In 1349, the English crown passed the Ordinance of Laborers. This was strict legislation attempting to legally freeze wages exactly where they were in 1346, right before the plague hit. It made it a literal crime to ask for higher wages, and a crime for a landlord to pay them, threatening massive fines for anyone who broke the rules. They essentially tried to legislate the law of supply and demand out of existence.
But, spoiler alert, the legislation failed completely. Why? Well, because you can't eat a royal decree. Landlords faced a stark, brutal economic reality. They could either obey the law, refuse to pay higher wages, and watch their fruit and standing corn literally rot in the fields, leading to total financial ruin, or they could break the law, illegally pay the peasants the higher wages they demanded, and actually get their crops harvested. The threat of legal liabilities paled in comparison to the immediate threat of ruined crops and starvation. Because of this, the ordinance was routinely and flagrantly ignored by both sides. Just listen to this quote from an English nobleman. It perfectly captures the sheer frustration and total powerlessness of the upper class. The workers were described as bloody-minded because they took no notice of the king's command. Economic reality simply overpowered royal decrees. The workers had the leverage, and absolutely no piece of paper could change the fact that their labor was desperately needed.
Now, it's really important to note a fascinating historical divergence here. While Western European wage suppression failed spectacularly, Eastern European nations like Prussia, Bohemia, and Poland took a much darker path. To maintain the status quo, Eastern nobles resorted to extreme physical coercion, forbidding tenants from leaving without permission or paying massive fees. They effectively tied the peasants directly to the land, reinforcing serfdom rather than letting it dissolve.
Finally, Section 5, the end of serfdom, a shifting social order. Let's wrap up by examining the long-term legacy of this massive labor shock in Western Europe. The sheer scarcity of labor was a massive enough shock to completely overthrow the entire medieval notion of serfdom in the West. Laborers successfully demanded physical mobility, kind of like the medieval equivalent of remote work freedom, right? They gained the right to move to whichever estate paid them best. They negotiated vastly improved tenement agreements that completely did away with mandatory unpaid labor services to the lord. Instead, it transitioned to a much more modern system requiring only the payment of cash rent. The fundamental relationship between worker and employer had changed forever.
Of course, economics is always in motion. By the year 1500, Europe's population began to recover, bouncing back from 60 million up to 81 million. As the labor supply returned, human labor became less scarce, which inevitably caused a slow slide in real wages from their mid-15th century peak. However, even as wages cooled down, the heavy institutional chains of Western European serfdom had been broken for good. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to consider. The Black Death was an unimaginable tragedy, yet it inadvertently empowered the lowest classes and broke a deeply entrenched feudal system by fundamentally altering the labor market. It kind of makes you wonder, what sudden shocks or hidden forces are quietly reshaping the foundations of our own economic structures and labor markets today? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.